Hello, San Salvador. I'm doing my Jack Cruz impression. Hello, San Salvador. It's great to be here in the only monarchy in the Western Hemisphere by my count. And, as an American monarchist, this is a little bit of a dream come true that this place simply exists, and then to find that it's as successful as it is truly remarkable. And so I guess I want to talk about it feels like El Salvador is a monarchy, but I feel like there's still a lot to learn about monarchism in a way, because I feel that essentially, what happens when people have good ideas is you'll often see a lot of independent reinvention. And I feel that, when people try and do, the state as a work of art, solus populi suprema lex in the 21st century, they naturally, as they just pragmatically examine the situation, come up with a lot of old ideas that they basically reinvent themselves, which is great. On the other hand, if you see that phenomenon and know that phenomenon, the idea of, okay, what can we actually learn from the past pops out. And, essentially, I view, this little resurgence of a working, functional, very impressive monarchy in the modern world is it's a recovery in some ways from 250 years of really questionable thinking about governance. And the thing is, if we go back before that time period and we think about what does it mean to be a country, what does it mean to be a state, we basically encounter this gold mine as we get this Anglo-American, theory out of our systems. And so, one way to ask, the question, of course, we have these modern monarchies that are companies, right? And so, one way to ask the question of what to do with El Salvador is to say, what would happen if we had Steve Jobs or Sam Altman or some other, really effective modern monarch in charge of a country? But another way is another question we can ask is, what would Louis XIV do? Because Louis XIV actually found, inherited a country that was in a lot of turmoil and basically made it, the leading nation in Europe. And so I think that, if I love to recommend books. Obviously, books are long and hard to read, but the book that I always recommend essentially as a starting point for the classical theory of the nation is Vattel's Law of Nations. That's V-A-T-T-E-L, which is a wonderful summary of basically classical theory of the nation state before liberalism, before English liberalism really gets its hands on that theory. But it's late enough that Vattel was actually the standard textbook of, the American founders. So, because when you go back to the 18th century, people are starting to invent a lot of new ideas in the 18th century, but they're also, in some ways, unconsciously full of these old ideas. And so it's the old ideas that we need to find and remake. There was a great president of South Africa, Paul Kruger, who said, let us take what is good and noble from the past and use it to build the future. And, and that's essentially, the task here in, here in El Salvador, which is one of the most, one of the smallest, one of the most historically troubled nations in the Americas, with basically, not a whole lot of capital besides the fact that it's a country. And it's used the fact that it's a country to go from a frightening place. I mean, you can still see, you drive around San Salvador, there's all this barbed wire everywhere, right? And you're looking at that and you're just like, how long is it gonna take of the Bukele era for people to start realizing that their place would look a lot nicer without barbed wire? And 5 to 10 years, I don't know. It takes a long time for people to forget this kind of incredible reign of terror that went on here. And just showing that government can end the reign of terror is it's just an incredible step. And, you know, it's world historic. But, you know, I think in some ways, in a sense, it's only the start, or it should be only the start. So what I look at, there's sort of two parts to the theory, the classical theory of the state, that I want to go through. One of them is kind of an internal theory, and the other one is a kind of foreign policy oriented theory. And obviously, especially for a small country like El Salvador, foreign policy is super important. And let's talk about domestic policy first. So from the perspective of the classical theory of the state, one of the reasons why it's so easy to sort of go in the direction of a corporate analogy. I know President Bukele, you know, once had his Twitter feed say CEO of El Salvador, which is sort of exactly right. It's like you think of the nation as a firm. And when you see the nation as a firm, you're really stepping outside this kind of Lockean Anglo-American idea of sort of the, you know, the Republican, you know, government by consent idea, the government that works, you know, that sort of the people are in control of, that kind of represents the people. You're like, no, the state is a firm. And what are the assets of this firm? The assets of this firm are the land of El Salvador and the people of El Salvador and whatever's in the vaults over the National Bank over there. And those are tremendous assets. Those are amazing assets. Basically, even, you know, I don't think is El Salvador the smallest country in Latin America? Not quite, maybe Belize, you know. But it's not a big country. It's not a famous country. It's been for a while, occasionally been an infamous country, but it's a country. And so, you know, what can you do with that country? And the first thing the Bukele regime has done is to say, well, the fundamental purpose, the first and fundamental purpose of government is to have a monopoly on violence. And everything else needs to be, you know, subordinated to that. All of your ideas of like liberal democracy and juridical defense and the rule of law, you don't have the rule of law unless you have the rule of order. And that's something, you know, America has no shortage of gangs. We've got, you know, I think somewhere between 1 and 2 million gang members in the United States. That's an army. That's a giant frickin' army. And these people are loyal to their gangs rather than loyal to the US government. And like when you look at basically, now we don't quite have the advantage that you had in here in El Salvador, which is that basically they use tattoos as uniforms. So if you have a gang tattoo, you're in a gang. And if you don't have a gang tattoo, you're not in a gang. You know, and that's almost, as I understand, very, very reliable. You also have the advantage in El Salvador that the gangs here were not really narco gangs. They were basically devoted mainly to like small-time crime and extortion and basically charging taxes on their little neighborhoods. And so there's not this kind of there's not as much money in the gang business here as in this place like Mexico. But, you know, it was still, I mean, it's just an amazing achievement to sort of pull that down. And it's also, you know, reminiscent of, you know, what they call mano dura policies have failed many, many times, for example, in Honduras, you know, and, you know, of course, the liberals are just like, see, you can't repress the people will always fight back against your injustice. And you're just like, no, actually the hand wasn't hard enough. and like when the hand is hard, it's just like, you know, the feeling of you feel safe in this country. It's incredible, right? You can tell like the difference between, you know, being here in the historic center and being in, say, Sao Paulo in the historic center, night and day, right? You know, and that's a huge, huge transition. Okay, but let's go a little further with this in a sense. And we say basically that the nation is the owner of the people in a way that just totally spits in the face of Anglo-American liberal democratic thinking throughout history. And when you say the people, you know, the people of El Salvador are, you know, the land is great, beautiful place, you know, the people are still the primary asset. And so what you have to basically, if you're a responsible government, you know, and you subscribe to this pre-modern, you know, theory of the state and of society, you realize that it's your mission as the government to make sure everyone in the country realizes their full potential and is turned into the most like amazing person that they can become. And that's a hard problem, and it's an especially hard problem if you're not a believer in Anglo-American liberal egalitarianism. And you're like, that actually means different things for different people in many different ways. And so actually El Salvador, being a real country, has just a complete range of human beings in it. And like, you know, all of those human beings are the property of the state and the care of the state, and the state needs to maximize their human potential in terms of the contribution they can make. So, for example, if you go kind of from the upper class to the middle class to the lower classes, that means very, very different things for different groups of people. Now, you know, every country in the world essentially has an upper class. This is a class, you know, I hate to repeat any, you know, difficult heresies here, but the fact is the bell curve is real, IQ is heritable, and human beings have different potentials. And, you know, what that should tell, you know, us in the 21st century who have a sort of cultural liberalism that we can't really get beyond, and I'm not even sure should try to get beyond, is that basically, I mean, because this was also the thinking of like Charles I, like everyone at every level needs to flourish in that way. And so the thing is, when you're basically looking, for example, at, let's take the upper classes, okay? The main goal when managing the upper classes is to basically keep them. You want to keep their human potential. You want them developing the country. You want them working for the country. You don't want them in New York. And if you do have to send them to New York, you want them to come back. And that's a hard problem. And especially like you're dealing with this upper class, it's fundamentally a cognitive upper class. And because it's a cognitive upper class and heredity is by no means an exact science, what you're going to see is you're going to see people who are basically born into a cognitive elite all over the country in all classes, predominantly in the upper class, but also in all classes. And so, you know, one of the goals in kind of managing this upper caste elite is to basically find them all, find all of these kids, and basically bring them into, because it's a small upper class, you have to create a really powerful hothouse environment, basically, in which like the best of the best, you know, feel if they go, heaven help us, to MIT for college, they should feel like it's a step down. And the thing is, you know, just by the laws of mathematics, there are, we don't know who there are, but, you know, there are probably 50 or 100 kids in El Salvador right now who are in high school for whom MIT would be a step down. You need to find all those kids and you need to own them and you need to bring them into a place that basically maximizes their human potential because they're out there and they're amazing and they're the property of the country. So, you know, it's like when I was a kid, of course, I was a libertarian. I was absolutely horrified by the Iron Curtain. It seemed like the worst thing in the world. And I didn't understand the rationale, you know, for that, which was essentially to prevent brain drain from the Eastern Bloc. Now, I'm not suggesting that El Salvador, you know, install an Iron Curtain, but what I am suggesting is that the value of keeping these people and keeping their assets and keeping their money in the country is absolutely enormous. And so actually, you know, I mean, making the country free of crime is a huge thing for people like this. But let's switch over in a way, you know, middle classes always need the least help from the state. They're sort of almost, if you're middle class, you're kind of flourishing by definition in a way. And it's really the lower classes that in the way need the most help and need the most care from the state. And so when we look at the lowest of the low, you know, we see all these famous pictures and videos of the gangbangers in the giant new prison, and they're all sitting like this, and they're moving in ways that make it clear that they have been trained that unless they do exactly what they are told, they will be hit. Which is really, very essential and the start of sort of order and discipline for these people. But the thing about these people is that, okay, not everybody in the lower class in El Salvador in the gang period joined a gang. Certainly true. Many people tried to live in a reasonable way. Many, of course, fled to the United States. Some people wound up in gangs. And the thing is, when you look at these gangsters, you have to say, to what extent are we looking at normal human beings or who have just been socialized into an insane system, or are you looking at people who are really psychopaths? Because if somebody is really a psychopath, basically, that's it. They have to be in close custody forever. They can't be released back on the street. But if someone is not a psychopath and just basically happen to live in a psychopathic environment, you basically want, that person, let's say he's like 25 now, by the time that person is 40, you want him to be a productive member of society who just remembers the crazy time that he was in. And, and how do you do that? You do that by basically adopting a very paternalistic, pre-modern system of governance. And of course, one of the big missing pieces that has basically been sort of destroyed in the modern world is the church. And, or the church is plural because, of course, Salvador has many evangelicals as well as Catholics. It's sort of amazing how, when you look, for example, at Elizabethan England, you're like, oh yeah, they're English, they're doing English things. And then you realize that this is a monarchical state. And as a monarchical state, it has a state church. And of course, even before there was an Anglican church, the state was aligned with the church. And one of the principles of having a state church is the church is the government of your personal life. The state is for crime, the state is for, whatever, but the institution that manages you as a human being, that makes sure you're on the up and up, is the church. And so, the sort of start of this thing you see, and I think that they're already in the prisons are religious study groups and people who find, God instead of gangs. That's great. But the thing is, it's expensive to hold people in these warehouses, and frankly, they could be working. They could be, I definitely have seen things in El Salvador that could be cleaned up by chain gangs. And absolutely. And the thing is, what is a chain gang essentially? Oh my God, a chain gang, right? What is a chain gang essentially? A chain gang is saying, okay, you have committed crimes, you've been a horrible person, even if you're not a sociopath or a psychopath, basically you've done psychopathic or sociopathic things. And so we are going to restore you to humanity. We are going to re-socialize you. And the first way that we're going to do that is you are going to have a lifestyle where you do basically two things. One of them is work and the other one is pray. And putting basically someone who, and that's going to be socially enforced. And so when you basically have this kind of enforced social structure around these kinds of people where they get basically used to being peers with people who exist in this world, you have to form them into groups. You have to have a lot of group psychology. Your basically path to becoming a human being probably starts with unskilled labor. Maybe you get trained in a trade. A lot of these people can do trades. Of course, El Salvador is well known for having hardworking people. That's one of their regional reputation issues, and most stereotypes are true. And so then you're like, okay, at what point is it possible to release these people onto the street? It would be nice to erase their tattoos. I realize that's kind of expensive, but maybe buy a laser and just run them through a few times. And it would be nice to erase their tattoos, maybe that's not a requirement. But the thing is, if these people are going out on the street, their whole universe needs to be monitored. If this person is going out on a street, they live in a place, People know where they live. They're probably in a barracks of some kind. They're in a situation where this basically system of like personal control that gives them absolutely no choice, but the straight path is retained. You're tracking them. You're air tagging them. You're making them piss in a cup. You're basically like exercising this kind of total level of control over these people, which is in a way similar to the kind of control that you had in a prison, but is basically set on sort of setting them on this kind of straight and narrow path as they kind of return to humanity. And, you know, for people who step off the path, you know, yeah, okay, this person is actually a problem. But my offhand guess is that at least 80% of these people could be rehabilitated. And like, but it's not a rehabilitation of love. It's a it's not a hippie kind of thing. It's basically like, you are gonna have to live in an orderly way. And we are gonna maintain this order of you. Actually, one of the first and most interesting colonial experiments in the New World was something called the Reductions of Paraguay, which was the Jesuit kingdom of Paraguay. And the Jesuits had this very interesting approach. I'm sure this is all very politically incorrect, but they had this very interesting approach to basically civilizing the local Guarani Indians. And their approach was to just basically regiment them in ways that made them basically live like Europeans. And what they found was that, you know, this could be done with basically pure-blooded Indian populations could be basically made to live like the European lower classes. And then the Jesuits got abolished and they went to hell. And Paraguay has never recovered. But you know, that feeling of basically you are taking people and like you as the state should be concerned when you're just like, here's a situation where I have a person in this country who is capable of more than they're giving or capable of being more than they're being and is not doing so. So one example of the kind of policy that basically, and this is more aimed at the middle classes, one example of the kind of policy that was very much practiced by Louis XIV and you know, has also been tried by various 20th century Latin American regimes is a policy of protectionism, is import substitution. Of course, you go around El Salvador, you see a lot of imports from China. Okay, you go around America, you see a lot of imports from China. You don't actually see a lot of imports from America. You have this situation where everything is made in China. So you're not alone here, Salvadorans, right? And basically what that's doing is basically that's saying, well, here is this product that maybe we could make ourselves. But if we made it ourselves, it would be more expensive, so let's spend some foreign exchange on it. That's true, but also if you made it yourself, you know, and the targets of this kind of import substitution have to be chosen very well. I'm not saying that, like, you know, El Salvador should produce its own phones made out of sand and software, right? You're not at that level yet, but there's a lot of things that basically you could essentially sort of progressively tariff into existence in the construction of genuine domestic industries, starting probably with light industries and working your way up. And that basically creates, when you have these industries, you're spending more money, your consumers are spending more money, you have less money leaving the country, and we'll get to kind of the foreign policy aspect in the moment. It's very crucial. Balance of payments is super important, and protectionism, of course, helps with that by definition. But the most important thing is that you're basically giving people productive lives. And we're in a situation in the world now where, you know, it's very strange because the necessity of sort of human beings is in question in ways that it has never been in the past. And that extends from like the manual labor that is, you know, replaced by machines, you know, steam shovels instead of shovels, all the way up to now we have AI, you know, bumping off graphic designers, basically. Bad time to be a graphic designer, you know, and so like making sure that your humans are useful and relevant is just a supremely important task. sending them abroad to, install drywall in California and send remittances back. Well, remittances are very important because that affects your balance of payments. But essentially, like whenever you look around you and you see people who are basically not living up to their human potential, that's the state wasting an asset, okay? And as a firm, you don't waste assets. And like, that, involves like the sort of creation and sponsoring of industries. For example, El Salvador has amazing coffee growing, basically land. And the Salvadoran coffee industry was, as far as I'm aware, like totally devastated by warfare and gang wars and war wars and all this 20th century nonsense. But you still have this amazing, amazing land for basically producing coffee plantations. But it takes a while for a coffee tree to grow. And so, basically, when I used to be a libertarian, I'm like, oh, well, the free market will take care of that. No, actually, I think that basically Louis XIV would very much disagree with that. Louis XIV are like, oh, the French are good at knitting tapestries. Let's establish, this amazing state, tapestry company. Protectionism and especially state industries have earned a bad name in a lot of ways. And the reason that they've earned a bad name is that they're very good for corruption. They very, very easily become corrupt. And because they're basically great ways to steal in all kinds of ways. And this is one of the advantages of a monarchy, which is that basically because the king owns everything, the king owns nothing. And if you're working for the king, basically, and like trying to feather your bed at the same time, like that, you're stealing from the king, basically, and you don't want to do that. And so, a lot of these systems where America tried to impose its system of government on the whole rest of the Americas and did that, very proactively, and like basically, doing democracy in, a Massachusetts town meeting has the effect of like opening everything up and having everyone, but like basically distributing authority in a third world country basically means no one's responsible, no one's in charge, and everybody steals. And the effect of like most people do not understand the power of a monarchy to eliminate corruption, and it's immense. I mean, another of the great stories, very different monarchy, very different kind of country, but MBS in Saudi Arabia sort of had, I mean, all third world countries have long-standing traditional elites, and there's a very wealthy elites in some ways, and a lot of these elites basically get into the stealing from the government kind of, routine, and that was very true in Saudi Arabia. And so what Mohammed bin Sultan did when he came to power was, the famous Ritz incident where he basically took all of the rich people in Saudi Arabia and said, you're going to declare all of your assets overseas, and we're going to investigate how you got them, and we're going to take them back. That was not popular in some circles, but he had the power to do it, and he did it, and he's created a really strong state there.